I'm the independent chair of the inquiry into the Sheffield street tree dispute. Thanks for joining us again. Could I ask you please to tell us your name and your role?
Yes, Dr. Billings, and I'm the Police and Crime Commissioner for South Yorkshire.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for coming, I really appreciate it. I run through at the beginning of each of these conversations some standard material. Please don't take anything from the fact that I'm asking you, I'm mentioning this to you because I'm telling everybody the same thing. And the first thing is this is being broadcast and recorded and will be uploaded for people to see afterwards. You understand that?
Yes, that's fine.
Very good. And the second thing is, as you know, the dispute generated quite a lot of stress and anxiety and emotion in some people's minds, and it's important for our proceedings that that doesn't get reflected through remarks which are defamatory or libelous or bring into the public domain private information about individuals. I'm not expecting to run into those difficulties with you this morning, but were I to be concerned about that, I would flag to you that I'm a little bit concerned we're heading into difficult territory, and were my concerns not to be allayed in extremis, I may have to pause the hearing, just so you're aware. On which note, can I please ask you, before we get into a list of topics that I've sent you in advance, if you would like to give any introductory remarks?
Yes, perhaps the best way in is for me to say a little bit about my role as Police and Crime Commissioner, and to distinguish that from the role of the Chief Constable, since we're talking principally about the police and their operations here. So I appoint the Chief Constable. I appointed the Chief Constable, who was the Chief Constable at the time of the trees dispute. There was Stephen Watson, now Chief Constable in Greater Manchester, and I appointed the present Chief Constable, Lauren Poultney. The Chief Constable is responsible for the operational activities of the police force. I don't run the police force, Chief Constable does. I talk to the Chief Constable on a regular basis and the senior officers. I seek to influence them and persuade them, but at the end of the day I can't instruct them to do things. They are operationally quite independent of me. My role is very different. I'm an elected person, elected now for the third time in South Yorkshire as Police and Crime Commissioner. I have a number of functions, roles there. I first of all produce a police and crime plan, which is refreshed each year. It sets out the priorities for the police force. I assemble the finances along with the Chief Constable. We put the budget together for running the force. I set the precept, determine the precept, that bit of the council tax, which goes for funding the force. I have other functions as well, which take us a bit beyond what we're talking about here, but I have some convening powers that enable me to bring together people involved in the criminal justice system more widely, which may be probation and prisons and courts and so on. As chair of the local criminal justice board, I do that. But quite a lot of my time is spent holding the police force to account. So I do that in a number of ways. I've mentioned that I meet the Chief Constable on a regular basis, so we have those informal type conversations. I also hold a monthly meeting of something I call the Public Accountability Board, which is held in public. The media are present, the press are present, members of the public can come. It's often live streamed, it's recorded and put on our website, in which I have reports from the police and interrogate them, talk to them about what they're doing and whether they're meeting those priorities and doing the things that the people of South Yorkshire want of them. So they're my principal kind of activities and functions. As far as this dispute is concerned, I think it's important for me to say right at the beginning that, and I discuss this regularly with the Chief Constable and the police during the time of the dispute, that they have their job to do, and their job is to not interfere with the rights of protesters and demonstrators, to enable people to protest. That's their legitimate right to do that. Equally, they have to ensure that people who have a legitimate right to go to work can go to work and do their job. That's a very difficult balance sometimes for them, so they tend to be in the middle there. but their job is not to side with anybody. They have to be impartial in what they do, but to enable protesters to protest, enable people to go about their lawful business. And it's getting that balance right that I think preoccupied me during a lot of this time, and clearly it's a matter all the time for the police. So my consistent view throughout the whole of this business is that what we had here was a legitimate policy of the City Council that essentially, and that was democratically decided by the Council. People voted on it at election time, voted for the Lib Dem and Labour councillors whose policies it was. And the job of the police, the police were drawn into that because some people objected to the implementation of that policy around trees in certain parts of the city. But essentially the role of all the way through this, I think the dispute was essentially a political dispute between the council and some of its residents that it ought to have resolved politically. The police got drawn into that.
Okay, thank you very much. That's extremely helpful. Can I just make sure I've understood one point that you've made in your introductory remarks before we go on to the topics I've asked to discuss with you? I've heard in my hearing so far from some witnesses who essentially feel that they thought the role of the police was, to quote one of them, to protect them. What I've heard from you is that, if I've understood you correctly, and I'm asking whether I have, is that the role of the police essentially, to summarise, is to uphold the law and maintain public order. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, clearly, if something is happening, if something kicks off and people are being, I don't know, if there's a scuffle or people are fighting or whatever, then clearly the police have to intervene in that. But it's that their job when they turn up is to ensure that protesters can protest and people can go about their lawful working activity. And that's it, really.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much indeed. Now, I'd like just to ask you initially whether there are any issues you think it particularly important that my inquiry looks into, within, I should say, the scope of the terms of reference that I've published. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions on that?
I think that one of the things that concerned me throughout was the nature and the extent of consultation that went on between Sheffield City Council, the public in general, and specific groups within that, particularly those who are concerned about the trees and the policy of the trees. So I think there are questions that I would want to ask there about, as I say, the nature of that engagement and how consistent that was and how detailed that was and exactly what the council was doing during that time. I think that's very important. But also their engagement with the police and how far ahead they were planning things with the police and enabling police to know what their operation was going to be so that the police could form their own plans around that, and whether they were allowing sufficient time for the police to think about that and form views around that. So those would be areas that I think would be important for me.
Okay, very good, thank you. When, do you remember, did you become first aware of the street tree protests?
First became aware of the protests in November 2016. On the 2nd of November I received an email from a member of the public. They were expressing concern at what they thought was a heavy-handed approach of the police, and this was in Nether Edge, and the use of what they called trade union legislation by the police at that time. People have been arrested, a couple of people have been arrested by the police on that day for, as the police put it, causing annoyance and preventing lawful work, and that was reported on regional television, it was on calendar that day. And then we had 16 further emails following up on that. So from the 2nd of November onwards we were getting emails through about that.
Okay. And when, to your knowledge, did the police start working with the council on policing the protests? And I don't know if you know this, but whether those discussions started before or after the police started to be called out to incidents on the streets?
Well, I mentioned the 2 arrests that had made on the 2nd of November, so I became aware of that. I think the next thing I became aware of was probably the incident on Rustings Road, which was a little bit later in November, on the 17th of November. I think it's... Well, if I stop there, you may want to ask...
Yeah, I just want to check something, which is... I'm trying to establish whether the police were in dialogue with the council about the risk of protest before they found themselves on the streets and having to arrest people. But from what you said, you're not aware of whether they were or not.
I couldn't put a date on it, but clearly from that date in November, the police were involved. Yes.
Right. Okay. So I want to ask you about, as no one will be surprised to know about what happened on Rustings Road in November 2016. And my first question is, when you became aware of that operation, what you thought the role of the police should have been, and what in fact the police did on that day?
Yes, I think for me that was an important moment, what happened on Rustings Road, and I think there were some important lessons that we all learnt very quickly as a result of the incident on Rustings Road. So I first became aware of that on the 17th of November. I'd had a number of requests from the local media to comment on what was happening there, and the council issued a statement as well at that time. The person with cabinet responsibility, Councillor Lodge, issued a statement, so I was aware of that. And if I mention a statement or an email, we can supply you with all those documents, and we'll do it afterwards. So on the morning of the 17th, there were these media stories running around about what had happened, and I asked for, and I got an operational briefing from Superintendent Morley, who was in charge of the operation on Rustings Road. And he told me the following things, so I'm just itemised them here. He said, first of all, the council had approached the police around 6 months previously, which partly goes to answer your previous question, of course. So 6 months previously, to advise there were issues with protesters following workers and standing in the way of them carrying out their work. So he told me that. The council had asked the police for assistance around public safety and disorder issues. The police had identified legislation, and that's the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act 1992, that protesters were in breach of. The police had provided guidance that if a situation arose where protesters were preventing work taking place, they would try to resolve the situation in a particular way. So they'd first of all try to resolve that peacefully, so that the work could be carried out. And if that didn't resolve the issue, then that legislation could be invoked to arrest people. He told me that the police, the council and Amy conducted a risk assessment around the tree removal on Rustings Road, and they'd looked at all sorts of things to form that risk assessment. They looked at social media, what was happening, what people were saying on that, risks at the location itself, and how they changed those risks depending on the time of day. So that South Yorkshire Police were more aware that the protests and the times of day would be key to how people were reacting on the ground, and therefore what issues might arise in terms of public safety and whether protesters are putting themselves in harm's way and so on. Those risks were all put, as Superintendent Morley told me, those risks were all put to the council and to Amy, and but it was Amy and the council who made the decision when to start the work. The time of day was their decision. So it's not for the police to tell people when to start work or finish work or how to do it, but the police did talk through the risks with them of starting that work at particular times of day, what the risks might be. Now that was important for me to know because I wanted to be absolutely clear that the police were not colluding with the council in any of this. They were simply doing their job as police, which I outlined at the beginning. So the council decided to intervene early in the morning to minimise the risk, and all decision making around that was a matter for the local authority and for the contractors. It's probably also important to say, because this did happen, vehicles were moved because it was early in the morning. South Yorkshire Police were not involved in any of that. It was the local authority that put in place the road closure order, the notices about that, and the removal of vehicles that were obstructing the work. That was all for the council and its contractors. In fact, on the day, early in the morning, South Yorkshire Police provided a small number of officers, 12 officers altogether, to support the operation that took place over quite an extended period, half a mile stretch with over 8 sites that were in there, and it was clearly going to be quite a difficult site to manage because it was over quite a lengthy period. So Superintendent Morley described this approach to me and said it was proportionate, and I accepted that. Then on the 17th of November I issued a statement to the BBC, and we can let you have that, and sought to explain the role of the police vis-à-vis the council, and it included these lines, and I'll quote them. The decision to fell trees was taken by Sheffield City Council. The police can offer advice, but decisions around timing and the closure of roads are likewise matters for the City Council. The only role of the police is to ensure that law and order is upheld and the public are protected, which is an operational decision for the Chief Constable. My role is to hold him to account for any decisions that he takes. Then if we go on a little bit, on the 24th of November I received an operational briefing from Assistant Chief Constable Jason Harwin, who was Superintendent Morley's boss. Again, we can give you a copy of that. And that briefing note summarised the things that I've been told verbally by Superintendent Morley. And again, the important section for me is this bit, and I'll read it. So this is in the briefing note that the ACC gave me on the 24th of November. As regard the parked vehicles, Sheffield City Council had obtained a road closure order for Rustlings Road and established that they would need to move a number of vehicles to undertake the work safely. They'd contacted the Mansfield Group to undertake this work. Sheffield City Council and Amy had indicated they would lead on this activity, but unfortunately on the morning of the operation they had not supplied the necessary staff to undertake this exercise. So that was the problem the police faced. There weren't enough staff, as they saw it, from Amy or the council to do the work that needed to be done in advance of the tree felling. As the lead officer, I considered it my moral responsibility to ensure that the 7 affected residents were given an opportunity, an appropriate choice, as to how their vehicles were to be moved, and therefore asked the officers present to assist in communicating the information to those local residents who would be impacted by this activity. We did not play any other part in this matter. And I thought that it put them in a difficult place. There were not enough staff from the contractors or the council to do what needed to be done in advance of the work, and the police, as the officer puts it, I consider it my moral responsibility to ensure that the affected residents were given an appropriate choice. Mm-hmm. So he felt put on the spot by that, and he did that. Now I felt that was unfortunate. They shouldn't have been put in that position. I understood why they'd done it, but I did say to them I thought that was unwise, because it began to blur the line between what the police should be doing and what the local authority should be doing. And I think, in fairness, police accepted that, they understood that.
Right.
But
okay.
it was about perception.
Yes.
At that point.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. You've provided a lot of important detailed information there, including on one of the things I'm interested in, which is who is responsible for what decisions through the course of that operation. So let me just check whether there's anything else you want to tell me about who took what decisions to carry out the Rustings Road operation and in consultation with who else? Or have you, maybe there's not anything else beyond what you just said, but if there is, I'm interested.
Well, I think that's the gist of it all, but other people began to get in touch with me at this time because they were equally concerned about, as I said, the perception of the police being involved in this in a particular way. So on the 20th of November I received an email from a representative of Sheffield Tree Action Group, STAG, asking that I meet them. I replied agreeing to meet, and STAG's email contained questions about the police response that I too was asking myself, the things that we've just outlined. I therefore sent to the Chief Constable Watson, that evening a list of questions, including those from STAG, and I copied in my Chief Executive and the Chair of the Policing Protest Panel. That's one of the panels that I have to reassure myself around the holding to account rule. So I got a number of those: an independent ethics panel, policing protest panel, independent audit committee, and so on. So that went off to the chair of the panel, Andrew Lockley. And again, I'll give you copies of that. And on the same day, I received a copy of a letter from an MP, Nick Clegg MP, that had gone to the council leader, and that again registered concerns and contained questions of the council. And again, I'll let you have those. And then on the 24th of November, I received Superintendent Sean Morley's briefing note that I mentioned previously. So that kind of brings that bit to
okay. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Now, you have had a long and very distinguished career in politics and public life in the city, and including on the council, as I understand it. So, what did you think about the wisdom or otherwise of the conduct of the operation, standing back on Rustings Road?
Well, I don't think I've had a long career in Sheffield politics. I was deputy leader at one time, but that was way back. As to whether it was distinguished, I have no idea. I'll leave that to others. So my view of the events in Rustings Road and the statement of the 7th of March. My view of the events on Rustings Road, in brief, my view is that that the police shouldn't have been put in the position they were put in, and I think that was unfortunate, because I think once the perception had been put into people's heads, it was difficult to shake that out of it. So they shouldn't have been put in that position, and probably they were put in that position because there was a misunderstanding of their role. Their role, quite simply, is to be impartial, to enable protests, to enable people to go to work. So once I got the answers to the various questions I got for Nick Clegg, the MP, for example, I sent an email to him, and I got the email for that, so you can read that. The final comments that I have around this whole incident were contained in an assurance report that went to the Public Accountability Board. So they're on the public record, and people can see them there. And that went to the Public Accountability Board on the 15th of December. And I did that for the sake of openness and transparency, so that we could communicate as widely as we could to the public what my view was, what was happening, and what we thought the position should be. I also received at this time, on the 8th of December, some questions from Councillor Joe Otten. He's a Liberal Democrat member of the council, and he was a member at that time of the Police and Crime Panel, which is the group of councillors from each of the districts, Rotherham, Barnsley, Doncaster, Sheffield, who hold me to account. And he was asking questions about the role of the police and so on and so forth. And the minutes of the panel's meeting on the 16th of December have got Councillor Otton's questions. He had a number of those, and they've got my response to that, so you can read that. Following the media inquiries received by my office after the panel's meeting, I released a further statement to the media. Again, I've got that for you. And that was used in reported news articles at the time, including national media as well, at The Guardian on the 22nd of December. So they're all in my media statement, and they convey my view. So my statement of the 7th of March 2017 makes the following points. I'll summarise it in this way. So between the 1st of December 2016 and the 28th of February 2017, I'd received 36 pieces of correspondence about the trees issue, more than any other topic that I'd ever had before.
Yeah.
On the 6th of January, I met with a member of STAG at his request, and there was a follow-up meeting with this member and other STAG members on the 24th of January. At my request, the chair of the protest panel, Andrew Lockley, was also present, and these were very positive meetings, I have to say. STAG members present expressed support for the way the police had acted. On the 13th of February, I received an operational briefing from the Assistant Chief Constable, Rachel Barber. She confirmed that relationships with the protesters were developing well between the local policing teams and of the police and STAG. She also said that the South Yorkshire Police Legal Services team were looking at the issue of the police use of trade union legislation as well. Then on the 25th of February 2017, I learned that the day before, 2 tree protesters had had criminal charges against them dropped by the Crown Prosecution Service on the basis of their application of the public interest test to that legislation. So they weren't saying that the legislation was inappropriate or wrong, trade union legislation, but that it wasn't in the public interest to pursue it. On the 28th of February, I received an email from Councillor Lodge asking me to hold off releasing a media statement, a draft of which I said I would share with him. The request related to whether my proposed wording would undermine what Sheffield City Council believed to be the legal grounds for future arrests of tree protesters. And then on March the 2nd, 2017, I received from the Deputy Chief Constable Staff Officer a copy of a response from Police Legal Services to a legal advice note of Council for the Council dated the 24th of February 2017 that Sheffield City Council had shared with him. The note again is attached to the documents I'll give you. That sought to encourage the police to use Section 303 of the Highways Act 1980 to deal with tree protesters. The supplying of a summary advice note from Council instructed by Sheffield City Council's Legal Services team to South Yorkshire Police's legal team represented to South Yorkshire Police concerning development in Sheffield City Council's approach to the trees issue, and the response from South Yorkshire Police's Head of Legal Services included this section. Sorry, that's a bit of a long-winded.
No, it's good. It's very helpful.
Getting to this. So they wrote to the Legal Services, Sheffield City Council, as follows. Firstly, in providing us with this note, the perception that is given is that the Council are now trying to influence the police into applying the criminal law in cases where it has been made clear to them that it would be most unsuitable both from an investigative and a prosecutorial perspective to seek to criminalise this behaviour. Importantly, the CPS have also made it abundantly clear that notwithstanding evidential concerns about some of the cases they have reviewed, there would be no public interest in pursuing the criminalisation of these passive protesters for what are summary-only offences. So that summarises what I was saying before, that it's not the legislation that's inappropriate, it's not in the public interest to use that, and there are other mechanisms anyway open to the Council, which is civil rather than criminal. On March the 2nd, I met with 2 members of the Save Nether Edge Trees group, one of whom was one of the two people against whom the CPS had dropped the charges the week before. The members felt they'd been denied their day in court and their opportunity to challenge the legislation by the charges being dropped. They said that on the day they were arrested, there was a clear change of tactics on that day. They described previous peaceful action where protesters had backed away when police asked. On this day, they said AMI contractors arrived waving legislation and told them today is different and you will be arrested. The members said they had been told by the police that the reason it was different on this day was because of the legislation that was being used. The members questioned the need for a target number of trees to be felled and said that 84% of the trees being felled are healthy. They described relationship with the tree fellers as good, and that where trees were being felled due to disease, they had stepped back from their protests. They said they would be happy to have discussions with Sheffield City Council if the council was willing to share information on what was happening. They did not believe what they were being told by the council and wanted to see more of the contract. On March the 2nd, I met with the council, having heard all that, on March the 2nd I met with the council's leader and the cabinet member responsible and the chief executive officer, and ACC Rachel Barber and an OPCC staff member were also present. I had requested the meeting and it had been arranged at my request because I feared that Sheffield City Council and the police had misunderstood what each was currently working on, re the protests and the law. So I was anxious around that. And also that the police were being drawn into what was essentially a political issue, which, as I say, is my view all along. This is a political issue, has to be solved politically by the parties concerned, and the police are getting dragged in. And a copy of my personal email to my PCC account of the 3rd of March records the substance of that meeting, what happened, my views around it, and we can let you have that. So my concerns were that the police were being drawn in, that Sheffield City Council wasn't understanding the police's role, that the police had, on Rustings Road, overstepped the mark for a very good reason, but it was perceived wrongly by members of the public and protesters, and that had been a misstep that they'd taken there. So essentially we got to reset the dial here, get back to police understanding their role, council understanding what the role of the police was, the public understanding that as well. This is not easy. And political decisions around the trees dispute had to be resolved politically. So we began by asking my view as a former councillor and with some political experience there. I would say, yes, I was disappointed that a nettle was not being grasped here politically in the way that I would like to see it grasped, and people weren't being brought together, and this was not being resolved in a peaceful and rational manner. Because when I met the tree protesters themselves in my office, we had rational conversations. We talked about rationally about ways in which this dispute could be resolved politically. So I was disappointed. That's why I asked for the meeting with the leader of the council.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Now, there's a lot. You've given us a lot of important detailed information there, which we will digest carefully. There's a couple of things I just want to ask you about from what you've just run through. You referred to concerns raised by Councillor Otten, and I'm aware of concerns he raised at that time. I just wonder if you are able to say a bit more about the things that were in the, I think you referred to an email, about the particular issues that he was raising there, just to check whether they're the same issues I think he wants me to have a look at.
Well, he asked quite a number of questions at the police and crime panel, so I've got all the questions. I think about 5 altogether.
Okay.
Maybe you want me to go through
well,
them.
if just tell me the topics for now, that would be...
Okay. Well,
does it relate, for example, to the base on which cars were towed away?
I'll tell you his first question was, why do you understand, who do you understand to be ultimately responsible for taking the decision to go ahead with the 17th of November police and AMI operation on Rustlings Road to fell trees in the early hours? That's his first question. So I've already given an answer to that one. It's a council decision based. The police are not telling them to do that. They give advice around what happens if you do things at certain times of the day. They took the decision to do it early in the morning. His second question was, it has been claimed that decision for the early start of the tree felling was on police advice. That's the bit that I've just commented on. Is that correct, and what was the advice? His third question was, it's been claimed that a vehicle containing police dogs was on Rustlings Road for a time on the 17th of November. Can you confirm or deny this? I said no police dogs were requested, utilised or present during the tree felling on Rustlings Road. I think that's a good example of the way, particularly with social media, a piece of misinformation can very quickly run around and people get the wrong end of the stick. That's an unfortunate thing to talk about, the trees dispute, but the wrong end of the stick. Councillor Otten then had a fourth question. A council's powers to close roads and tow vehicles are limited by regulations requiring notification and signage intended to prevent a premeditated ambush of parked cars such as we saw. What are the consequences of police assistance in this aspect of the operation should it be shown to be unlawful? I replied to that, the road closures as outlined above are the responsibility of the local authority. The police only have powers to close in respect of emergencies, while the local authority need to secure the road closure orders. Only the police can enforce them if required. In respect to the operation on the 17th, the police were advised by the local authority that road closure orders were in place and would accept this as being the case. Even if it was subsequently discovered that these were not in place or were not lawfully obtained, the fact that the police acted in good faith would negate any liability for the police for any actions taken. The police did not have any involvement in obtaining authorisation for the road closures of the 17th, and the removal of vehicles were arranged and undertaken by council contractors. To speak about a premeditated ambush is not helpful and seems designed to heighten emotions in a quite gratuitous fashion. This emotive language was also implied by the MP for Hallam, Nick Clegg, in the letter that I refer to, when he spoke about people being dragged from their beds by the police. This undermines trust in the police service, and I hope he will think twice before uttering such nonsense in the future. Councillor Otten then asked the fifth question: what changes have been or will be made to South Yorkshire Police policy in regards to street protests as a result of these events? And I said, I've asked the Chief Constable to keep me informed of any operations that might see a repetition of what happened on Rustlings Road, and also ensure, as far as possible, that officers are not drawn into carrying out any activity that properly is a matter for the City Council and the contractors, such as knocking on doors to ask people to remove cars. And then, as a supplementary question, Councillor Otten inquired whether police dogs were held in reserve, and I said no to that. A sixth question: what was the cost, not additional cost, but actual cost of police time, etc., as normally accounted for, of the police operation on Rustlings Road on the 17th of November? And in response I said the resources deployed were all in duty time and no additional costs were incurred. So total staffing time was 72 hours at £15.47 an hour. Now mid-level constable rate, and that was £1,113.84. As a supplementary question, again, Councillor Otten inquired whether the Commissioner would confirm that the figure of 12 officers was correct, and I said that yes, that's what the police had told me.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. And that does cover the particular issue I am aware Councillor Otten's been concerned about, to do with cars being towed. So thank you. We'll look at all that carefully. Now, the other follow-up question I had related to something that I'm looking into in respect to the use of the trade union legislation, and you talked about that a little bit, but I have also been told that a couple of things. Firstly, that after about February or March 2017, that legislation was no longer used during the course of the rest of the dispute, as it were. I don't know if you're in a position to confirm or otherwise that. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I've also been told that the Independent Office of Police Conduct looked at the fact that people had been arrested on legislation which had then been called into question, and that a number of people received compensation from South Yorkshire Police as a result. And I'm trying to establish whether what I've been told to that effect is the case or not. So possibly not now, but at some future point, if there's anything you could tell me which helps clarify or confirm that, that would be extremely helpful.
Okay, yes, we'll get back to you on that. No problem.
Very good, thank you very much indeed. So let me ask you a broader question now, which relates to how you would characterise the role of the police on the disputes during the middle of 2017. Apologies for the phone ringing, we're just turning it off. I'll give you the question again, just in case anybody is being distracted. Just wait till the phone is switched off. So let me give you that question again. And I'm asking for you to give me a characterisation, a judgment, in other words, a view about the police's role on the dispute during the middle of 2017. We'll come later to other periods, but at that point, what would you say?
Well, that particular period was fairly quiet for us in the office. We were not getting the volume of emails, inquiries and so on that we'd had previously, and I think between the 1st of June and the 31st of October I only received 2 items of correspondence that was related to the trees issue. And I think the reason for that was because, first of all, in my view, Sheffield City Council was starting to communicate more with the public and was also at the same time was taking steps to pursue its own means of tackling the issue of the protesters disrupting the work, and that they were going to take out civil remedies to deal with the tree protesters. So that made a difference. It was taking the spotlight away from the police and criminal charges and their legislation, and putting the spotlight back onto the City Council. But I was encouraged by the fact that they were holding those conversations with people. At least it seemed to me that was going on more at that time. So if we look at the legislation that the civil remedies that the council were doing, on the 27th of June the council issued a legal notice to a small group of tree protesters who they believe had disrupted tree removal and or breached the exclusion zone around the trees, and the notice outlined the civil remedies which the council could take if breaches continued. No mention of South Yorkshire Police or the application of criminal law. And the notice prompted a large number of comments on Stag's Facebook page that were critical of the council but not of the police. And then on the 18th of July the council issued a media statement announcing that it was seeking a High Court injunction to prevent trespass, which was disrupting the Streets Ahead programme. On the 18th of August, the High Court granted the injunction in favour of the council to last from the 22nd of August 2017 till the 25th of July 2018 to prevent, I'm quoting, to prevent any member of the public from entering, preventing the erection of or remaining within any safety zone erected around any tree within the city of Sheffield. And on the 5th of October 2017 the council provided a further media statement which talked about myths and truths that they wanted to address. So I felt there was more consultation, more engagement by the council with the public and the issues that But crucially, of course, they were pursuing these civil remedies.
Yeah, okay. Now, I want to ask if there's anything you want to tell me about your impression of the relationship between the council and the police around this period, including discussions on a proposed statement of intent or memorandum of understanding between the council and the police. I mean, I'm aware that there were discussions of that, and you sort of alluded when you referred to, I think you described, I think, if I remember correctly, as a sort of miscommunication between the council and police on who should be doing precisely what, and which led the police, as a result of what the officer responsible judged a moral responsibility, as you said, to do some things which in retrospect you thought were probably not the wisest thing to do. And then...
I mean, if you step back, they shouldn't have been put in that position. But once they were in that position, then I think the officer used his judgment and did something which prevented something worse happening. So
right.
It wasn't a good place to be, but it could have been worse if you had to use his judgment. So I wouldn't... Okay,
very good. Thank you for that clarification. But my question really is, so there was this ambiguity on the police had been put in this position they shouldn't really have been put in, and there was, as I understand it, an attempt to minimise the risk of that happening again through a discussion of a memorandum of understanding. So could you comment on the overall, what you observed overall in terms of relations between the council and the police, and anything you know about discussions on that memorandum of understanding?
I think if you look at what was happening on the ground, I think relationships between the people who were working, the contractors who were doing things on the ground, and the police who were on the ground, and the Sheffield City Council officers who were there, they were doing their best to make this work and to make it work well in everybody's interests. So that was kind of on the ground. But bear in mind the situation was always dynamic, so it was always changing moment to moment, and the police have to respond accordingly moment to moment. So these are not static situations, they're dynamic, they're fluid, they're changing all the time. At a strategic level, that's where the memorandum of understanding or statement of intent comes in. So what the police were trying to do was to establish with the council some ground rules around all of this, and a memorandum of understanding, statement of intent, was drawn up by the police. Now I've got a copy of that, and we can certainly let you have a copy of that. And that went to Sheffield City Council. It was, I think, produced by ACC, Assistant Chief Constable David Hartley. It went to Lorraine Manley from Sheffield City Council. And some of the key things in that were that the police were asking the council to consider resolving Sheffield City Council's legal issues in advance of operations, providing a dedicated Sheffield City Council community liaison function at the scene. I mean, from my own personal observation when I went on one occasion, the lack of that person from the council on the scene, on the ground, who could talk to people and explain things, I think was a serious omission. Should have happened. Please have liaison officers on the ground to do that sort of thing. They wanted in the memorandum of understanding a clear council commitment to a communications strategy. You need to, and it's got to be dynamic because the situation is dynamic. You need to explain what you're doing, and you need to do that constantly and consistently. General public, protesters groups, people on the ground, and so on. I think they felt that was either lacking or not clear enough. They wanted that, so that was in the memorandum of understanding. And providing South Yorkshire Police with more detailed council tactical level plans before operations. We will give you the tactical plans of the police for operations during this time. You'll see how they you'll see how they're set out in considerable detail and how they evolve, how they change.
Yeah.
Because every time the police undertake an operation, there's a briefing of all the officers concerned, and then the operation, and then there's a debriefing, and there's a learning from what happened, so that next time the tactical plan is different from the time before. And we'll show you in documents how that changes over time. They wanted some commitment from the council around getting some details about their tactical plans. So that was the memorandum of understanding. I think that could have been a crucial document. It's there. I don't think it was ever signed, but my knowledge may be lacking that one. But to my knowledge, it was never actually signed by the council.
Right. Okay.
I think that's a shame.
Right. Now, as you know, matters escalated significantly between the autumn of 2017 and March of 2018. I have a number of issues I'd like to discuss with you there, but maybe I could just start with asking you to give an overview of your concerns as matters escalated in that period.
Well, I started first of all to receive more correspondence during that time, so that causes alarm. On the 18th of January, for instance, I received a formal written question from Councillor Joe Otten, Police and Crime Panel member, to be dealt with at the forthcoming meeting of the Police and Crime Panel. That was on the 2nd of February. And the question was, do you believe it is a good use of police resources to intervene in peaceful protests regarding the felling of trees in Sheffield? On the 30th of January 2018, I met with members of STAG at their request. Also present at that meeting were members of the Save Gleadless Valley Trees group, the Save Nether Edge Trees group. At the meeting, members set out their main concerns as being the use of reasonable force by AMI and the AMI employees, tree felling sites, the way in which this had escalated the conflict as they saw it between AMI and Sheffield citizens, and as they put it, with the police caught in the middle, which I would agree with. I was told that since Christmas 2017, AMI had called on the police to arrest campaigners on several occasions, with 3 arrests having been based on video evidence secured by AMI's professional evidence gatherers. STAG members told me that the situation that had taken place on Mearsbrook Park Road, that was on the 22nd of January, and that encapsulated as they saw it, the current strength of feeling of residents towards the authorities. And then in February 2018, correspondence to my office increased again. I received 31 items of correspondence in that month. On the 19th of February, there was a meeting of the Policing Protest Panel. Although the main items on the agenda related to a far-right protest in Hexthorpe, you have to remember that we did have other things going on in South Yorkshire, and they were very much on our mind. And far-right protests, and that was the reason I set up the Policing Protest Panel in the first place, to deal with that. And then we got fracking potentially coming down the track, as well as this. So there was a meeting of the panel on the 19th of February. The main item was about the far-right demonstration in Hexthorpe, and indeed fracking issues, but ACC Hartley raised the trees issues and offered to provide the panel members with an operational briefing, which was very much welcomed by them. And on the 23rd of February, ACC Hartley released a media statement explaining to the public that a greater police presence would be seen, a change in resource level and potentially a change in policing style from that point. And he said this in his media statement: previously we maintained a low-key presence, and this has worked well with our officers responding only to incidents requiring police intervention. However, what we saw on Mearsbrook Park Road, which led to the pause in work was a definite change in behaviour and atmosphere. We saw disorder and violence resulting in a number of injuries. So that was ACC Hartley's statement, his media statement, and we have a copy of that for you. On the same day, Sheffield City Council also released a media statement welcoming his statement, and they said, with regards to police support around our legitimate tree replacement works on the highway. And that's how they saw it. And there's a copy of their statement in there as well. On the 24th of February, I emailed my chief executive. I said, I have had a lot of emails on my personal account. I think we need the panel to observe, the policing protest panel. Can you speak to the chair? And a copy of my email will let you have. On the 26th of February, my chief executive emailed the chair of the panel, Andrew Lockley, asking for the panel's involvement in the trees issue as soon as possible. And her email included the line, I understand a member of my staff, comms person, raised this last year, but the suggestion of panel involvement wasn't taken up by South Yorkshire Police. It didn't seem to want it at that time. However, this time, South Yorkshire Police are actively requesting the panel's involvement. So that was going to shift on their part, which I welcomed. They wanted the panel, policing protest panel, to be involved, to interview and to see, to observe, to go and look at what was happening. Again, we've got copies of that for you. There was a monthly public accountability board that day, and on the margins of that meeting, Andrew Lockley, the chair of the panel, was able to talk briefly to me and then to ACC Hartley, and that marked the beginning of the policing protest review work, which I asked them to do. In March 2018, I received 26 items of correspondence relating to the trees issue, and again that continued to give me concern. On the 6th of March, I issued a statement to the media which described the focus of my concerns at this time and announced that I had commissioned the policing protest plan to conduct a review. And we've got a copy of that media release.
Okay, very good. Is there anything else you would like to tell me about your discussions with the police in your regular meetings with them in this period between autumn 2017 and March 2018?
Well, probably you already picked up that I had regular meetings with the Chief Constable, they're weekly, and the Senior Command team weekly. Informal meetings, inevitably we talked about the trees dispute during that time. I discussed the issues regularly with my chief executive and members of my staff because they were involved with the police in different meetings at different points, and I wanted them to pick up things. And my chief executive discussed the trees issue with, she's a lawyer, solicitor, she discussed the legal issues with the legal department of the police during that time as well. So there was a lot of discussion going on around the whole issue in that way.
Okay. You said earlier that, and indeed you made public statements at the time, that you saw this essentially as a political issue, and you were encouraging the council to engage in trying to resolve it in a political way. I wanted to ask you what private representations you made to the council, or others for that matter, in 2017 and 2018 to encourage them to find a political resolution.
Well, quite a lot. Some formal, some informal. MPs, councillors, legal council, some. So when I look back through what we did at that time, on the 2nd of March 2017, I met with council representatives at my request to look at some of these issues. Now, during that meeting, it was made clear that the police would respond if breaches of the peace were committed, but they couldn't continue to commit resources in the numbers that they'd had previously. This was a real drain on numbers of officers.
So I may have misheard you. Did you say the 2nd of March 2017 or 2nd March 2018?
2017.
2017, okay.
I told the council I'd met with several tree protester groups, and they'd all assured me that they wanted to find a reasoned way forward. The protesters were not convinced that the Sheffield City Council's tree panel was a genuine attempt to solve the matter, so I raised that issue with them.
Yeah.
The council insisted they had tried and failed to meet the protesters halfway. On the 16th of March 2018, I'm just wondering now in my own head whether that March date is 18 or 17. I'll just check that.
So why don't we check that?
It is 17.
Okay, very good.
Okay.
And then a year later, you're coming on after.
Yes, we're a year later now, 16th of March 2000. I met with the council's chief executive. On the 29th of March 2018, I met with the council leader at the town hall.
On which date? Just give me that date again.
The 29th of March 2018.
Okay.
On the 22nd of August 2008, I met with Councillor Lewis Dagnall. He'd recently taken on the responsibility of the trees from Councillor Lodge, as I understood it, met him in the town hall. And I sent various emails to councillors, local MPs during that period. I mean, all through this period I was meeting people in Labour Party meetings, informally, in different ways, trying to persuade, and I think the MPs in fairness were doing the same, trying to persuade the council not to give up on meeting the protesters, trying to meet them halfway as they said they'd tried, but to go on doing that because, as I say, in my view, these are political issues that can't be solved by the application of criminal law. You've got to solve these politically.
Right. You met the leader of the council on the 29th of March 2018. That was 3 days after the council announced a pause in the, what some people call the felling, other people call the tree replacement programme, and that pause was never in fact ended. Do you recall anything about your discussion on that day, the 29th, 3 days after that statement made by the council?
I have to say that at that time, a lot of, the councils themselves, I think, were probably divided on the issue, and there was a lot of emotion flying around, and I didn't find any of these conversations easy. Conversations to have, people were often swayed by emotion, and that's not my style, first of all, but also I don't think it's very helpful at the time. So they were not easy discussions to have around that time.
And what was your impression of the preoccupations of the sort of leading councillors who were grappling with this issue at that time? What impression did you form of where they were coming from?
They were not as sanguine as I would be about whether they could have the sort of conversations that, in my view, you needed to have with the protesters to resolve the issues. They'd obviously had some bad experiences, where blame or fault lies, I have no idea, and all of that. But I was essentially saying to them, try again. And they were saying back to me, we tried. So it was not always a fruitful conversation that we were having.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. There was an evolution in the approach taken by the police to fulfilling their responsibilities in early, as I understand it, in early 2018, a move from something called Operation Test Date to Operation Keto. Could you just tell me your understanding of the rationale for that and what the effect of that change was?
Yes, there was a move from what the police called Operation Test Date, as you say, to Operation Keto. I think I've said in answer to an earlier question that policing activities is dynamic. I mean, what's happening on the ground is dynamic. So they're constantly changing their tactics or altering their tactics in the light of what's happening on the ground. And I described to you earlier that the police have very detailed tactical plans, briefing beforehand, debriefing afterwards, lessons learned, changing of the plans. So it's a fluid and ongoing situation. So even the original operation was never static. That was always evolving and changing. But there was something of more of a step change between these two operations. Now, I spoke with Assistant Chief Constable David Hartley about that, and he gave me his rationale for the change in the policing approach. In brief, he said this: the High Court injunction had been granted on Sheffield City Council's application. The injunction and the comments of the High Court judge had confirmed the lawfulness of Sheffield City Council's highways maintenance programme. So what they were doing was lawful in the view of the judge. The police had seen a difference in the meantime in the groups attending the protests from what they thought were, what they saw as local groups of residents and interested parties, to groups made up of people from outside of Sheffield, including people that the police believed were known activists, that they were regularly now appearing. And on one occasion when I visited a protest, we saw someone who was identified as coming from out of town to protest, masked, and tried to get inside the safety barriers. I was told he was actually from out of the country as well, but I don't know about that. So changed there in some of the people who were there on the protest. And as a result of that, there was a change in the police assessment of risk. They saw a heightened risk from this moment, and that meant they were going to had to change their approach and their tactics. On the 6th of March 2018, I commented on the change in South Yorkshire Police policing in a statement I released to the media, already referenced that, but the statement included these lines: the police response to tree felling in Sheffield has not changed. They must allow for peaceful protest on the one hand and enable people to go about their lawful business on the other. They must keep the peace and uphold law and order. What has changed is the decision by Sheffield City Council to take out an injunction against the protesters, which they, and not the police, implement. This has raised the temperature, is how I put it. Mm-hmm. I understand that ACC Hartley has made or will make all these documents available to you.
Okay, thank you. You touched earlier on the role of your panel on your advisory panel on policing protests, and Mr. Lockley, who I think you probably know is also coming to have a conversation with me. I just wanted to ask if you could summarise why in early March you commissioned a report from your panel into the policing of the street tree protests.
Well, I've already mentioned the fact that I visited a site. I did that on the 8th of March. That was Kenwood Park Road, and I went with the chair of the policing protest panel. So we saw what was happening. We were there for quite a while. It was a freezing cold day. I felt very sorry for the officers who had to stand there through their shift or however long it was. And resist. Some people were just holding banners and peacefully protesting. Other people were going up to them and shouting at them and getting very close to their face and so on. So it was not an easy thing to do for the police. They had to stand there and ignore all the provocation that was happening on that occasion. And we also saw one of the protesters jump on a private garden wall, and that enabled them to get into the area around the tree, beyond the safety barriers. They got under a cherry picker device as well, which was clearly unsafe, and eventually they had to be brought out. From that, the media were present, the regional television were there, and they wanted to interview me. We stepped to one side, but some of the protesters came up and were shouting during the time of my attempt to talk to the media. I had some sort of musical instrument blown repeatedly in my face, so it was a very unpleasant experience, and I felt that yes, there had been some change in the temperature here, and I wanted the panel to observe. And my concern is, the protesters will do what they want to do, not for me to come around them, and the tactics they employ, but I needed to know what the police were doing, how they were responding, and whether that was appropriate, hence asking the panel to go and look at that.
Okay. So your panel did a piece of work, produced a report. I wanted to ask you for your assessment of the report you were given by the panel, what you thought about the conclusions they drew, and what you thought about the recommendations they made. I also want to ask what happened about the recommendations that were made, but if you like, we can come on to that. If you just tell me those things first.
Yes, the panel did do a review. I thought it was a very good piece of work, so that was duly received, and we have that. I think you've got that. And I supported what they'd done, and I supported the conclusions, as did the police, and they said we'd all read it, we'd learn from it, and we'd take note of recommendations and implement them as far as we could. So as far as the recommendations to the police go within the report, they included some of these, but the police not travelling to sites in convoys with contractors, that they shouldn't do that, and I think that was absolutely right, unless intelligence showed there was a risk to vehicle or highways obstruction. So they seemed common sense things to me. I think we're aware all the time of the danger of misperception here. If you see contractors' wagons along with police wagons, but you see why the panel was saying you shouldn't do that if you could avoid it, but there may be occasions when that might be unavoidable. Ensuring there is officer presence on site to whom individuals could make allegations of criminal misconduct. Someone in police uniform who is clearly identifiable, who the protesters could go to and make their complaints to. Deploying officers in small numbers where possible, because again, the bigger the number of officers, the more people are getting anxious or excitable. Quicker and more tailored media responses. Distribution of leaflets explaining the distinct role of the police. Inviting the council and Amy to deploy senior officers to engage with protesters when felling was taking place. I think I've already mentioned that. But I think it was crucial to have people on the ground from the council, contractors, who could answer questions and talk to people about what was happening. And renewed pressure on the council to agree to the memorandum of understanding, which we've already mentioned, and that I regret was never, I don't think was ever signed.
Right.
So there's some of the key recommendations. Accepted them all, that they were really good.
Okay. Let me just ask you a question about whether my impression of the conclusions and recommendations is a fair impression. The impression I formed from reading the report and what you just said is there weren't major criticisms of the way the police were fulfilling their role. What there were was important, valuable, but sort of lower level operational suggestions on how they could do, if you like, even better. Would that be an unreasonable understanding?
Yes, I don't think they were overly critical of the police. I think there was a recognition of what a difficult place they were in, and they had to be careful around how what they were doing was being perceived, and they had to have a very good reason for doing what they did, and they had to explain what they were doing to the protesters on the ground at the time and to the public more generally. So yes, I think that's probably a fair summary. I wrote forward to that, and so my views are in theirs.
Okay. Okay, and could you just tell us, obviously matters moved on quite quickly following the report and things calmed down, but was there a sort of sustained recommendation, so far as you're aware, in South Yorkshire Police of the value of those recommendations, and they were sort of accepted as potentially being things to be borne in mind in future?
Yes, I think one of the things I've noticed in my time as Police and Crime Commissioner is that the South Yorkshire Police have come to really value a couple of panels that I've set up. One was probably three actually, because I came in at the time of the J report, child sexual exploitation in Rotherham, and one of the first things I did there was to set up a panel of victims, survivors and their families, for the police to learn from them, survivors of child sexual exploitation directly, what had gone wrong and what they could do differently. And I think the police came to value that panel. I think they've come to value the independent ethics panel that I set up, and I think they've come to value this policing protest panel. And now that fracking may be on the horizon again, we hope not, but it may be, then we will call the panel into existence again. The police understand that, and I think they welcome that. Now, I think they're all really good things. In fact, the Her Majesty's inspectors have commented on this, commented on the policing protest panel directly, and have said that they think it's been a good thing, it's worked well, and other police forces should do the same. So I'm pleased about that. But I think that's been a learning experience, if you like, for the police themselves, that these panels, who are independent of me, independent of them, I mean, can't go off on a frolic of their own, they have to do whatever the terms of reference are for the panel. But they're independent, and they can form an independent view, and then the police can form their judgments around that. And I'd be very surprised if they said, no, we're absolutely not taking on board what you're saying. So I'm very pleased with the way those panels have worked and the police have responded to them.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Now, your office and the police received significant numbers, I understand it, of requests for information, including under Freedom of Information legislation, about the roles of the police and of your office in the protest. Could you just describe the kinds of requests you received, and could you describe for us how you handled them and responded to them, please?
Well, unless it was a straightforward media inquiry, all requests for information relating to the trees issue were handled by my officers within the OPCC in accordance with that legislative framework around freedom of information requests. So between February 2017 and July 2020, we received 11 FOI requests relating to the tree disputes. One FOI request was transferred to the police that related the costs relating to policing the Chipping House and Rustling Road protests. One FOI request related to emails passing between me and senior officers at the police between February and March 2018. 6 FOI requests were received in relation to the policing protest panel report. They included requests for all documents and communications used by the policing protest panel to write the report, and copies of statements and police communications plan. 2 FOI's requests asked when I or the policing protest panel became aware of the Forestry Commission investigation. I must say I wasn't aware of the Forestry Commission investigation. I'm still not sure what all that was about. Wherever possible, information was provided. Our general rule is, if we've got it, we'll let people have it. Nothing to be gained by withholding anything. The main exemptions under the FOI use relate to not disclosing South Yorkshire Police's communications plan, and there are exemptions under personal information, law enforcement, health and safety headings, so they're the only kind of areas of exemption. Some information that we were asked for we didn't hold. Some information was accessible by other means, and we'd refer people to that. With the benefit of hindsight, were we to have a tree issue or something like that again, I think we would have had an FOI publication strategy in place straight away, much earlier on, so that members of the public could understand what information could lawfully be released, what they could lawfully ask for, but we didn't. So.
Okay. Now, as you know, this is a follow-up, and if you would like to take it away before answering, that's fine. But let me check whether you're willing to answer it now. As you know, the Freedom of Information framework allows for people who've requested information and had a response which says, well, we're not giving you everything because there are exemptions which we need to apply. The framework allows for those people then to go through a series of appeals, essentially, ultimately to the Information Commissioner. So far as you're aware or remember, was that system of appeal used in respect of requests made to you?
As far as I know, it wasn't. But my officers are telling me it was. So it was.
Okay. So we'll have some follow up on that. We'll have some follow up on that. And just so
I don't deal with these things directly.
No, that's fine, and nor should you. But just so you know, and those listening to the conversation know, I'm particularly interested in any cases where the Information Commissioner took a different view to the view that you had taken and asked for more material to be released. So if your team could just look at the cases where there were appeals and what the response to the appeal was, that would be very helpful to me.
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much indeed. The height of the dispute basically was in early 2018. Things have moved on a long way since then, and I wanted just to check with you whether you have an assessment of the current situation, or you have any concerns about issues that are currently faced or that you think might arise, given that the Streets Ahead programme runs up to 2037. Is there anything on your mind on that?
Well, we don't want any repetitions of what has happened. We've received no correspondence, no one's communicated with us to say that there are things brewing or happening. So as long as all the things that we've talked about during the course of this past hour or so are in place, then I would not have any anxieties. But if they were not there, then yes, clearly I would.
Okay.
Is that sufficient?
Okay, yes, okay, that's fine. Now, my next question invites you to use your perspective of somebody with a substantial history of following politics and public policy in the city, and who knows a lot of and has met and spoken over a long period to a lot of the key personae. And I'm trying to understand, through lots of the conversations I have, why it proved problematic to resolve the dispute in 2016 or 2017 when it proved possible to do so in 2018. So do you have any observation or insight that would help me understand that?
Well, there's no doubt that in my mind, there's no doubt that the council in the end came to soften its response to the protesters, was more willing to talk to people and to have that rational conversation, which, as I say, in my view, is the only way you'll resolve these positions. I think possibly at first, because it had a mandate, an electoral mandate to do this, it was a lawful policy that was established in the courts. They were not doing anything illegal. Most of the public, I think, were behind the policy most of the time. I think they therefore felt they had a right to carry on, to continue. My view is, as a politician, you have to be careful that you don't become what Lord Hailsham once called an elected dictatorship, that there are minorities, they have a view, you have to take that into account, and that's the art of politics, it seems to me, that you don't necessarily pursue your absolute right to do all these things. If it's having this impact on some citizens in some parts of the city, you have to find ways of working around that, find ways of compromise and meeting people halfway and so on. So I think as long as if that's the approach they now take, if that continues, then I think this is fine, this is okay. If there's a pulling back from that, then digging in the heels, then I think that way lies the difficulty. I also think that for the future, the councillors need to understand exactly what the role of the police is in these situations, and perhaps we need to get better at explaining that to councillors, because they may not always understand that. I think we need to do that with the public as well, what the role of the police is, so that where I began this conversation, that they understand that the role of the police is not to take sides, they are impartial, it is to keep the king's peace and to maintain law and order, but it's not to help, not to assist either the contractors or the council or protesters, but to maintain that balance within that. So a lot of explaining, understanding, they would be my things going forward that I would be looking for.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that. Is there anything you want to say about the consequences of the police having to attend the protests in such numbers? I mean, the police resources are finite, right? And there are many things they need to do. And so is there anything you want to say about that?
Well, it costs a lot of money.
Right.
In police overtime. It leads in the end, because it pulls resources out of places. And the public say to me, we want the police to be tackling crime and antisocial behaviour. Fine, but if large numbers of police officers are being pulled out on protests of this kind, then they can't be somewhere else.
Right.
So it had an impact on policing resources, and that is concerning to me. As we mentioned earlier, the possibility of fracking coming back to this part of the world. The protests around that are likely to be just as intense, if not more so, and on sites that are much more difficult to police, and they're going to have a huge impact on resources and police numbers. So there's an impact in that way. But also, I think, again, from my perspective, one of the most serious things here is the impact that it has on public trust and confidence in the police. If the view is formed that the police are acting in a particular way, let's say protesters persuade people that they're acting on behalf of the council or on behalf of the contractors against lawful protests, that's damaging for the police and the reputation of South Yorkshire Police. So we don't want to put them in that position. So the reputational damage to the police that something like this can produce, if not handled very carefully, and the police are very sensitive to that. Other people may be less sensitive to that, and that would worry me.
Yes, thank you. That's a valuable perspective. Thank you very much indeed. With the benefit of hindsight, I don't know whether there's anything else you'd like to identify that might have been done differently by any of the main stakeholders, in particular the council, but also the police, during the course of this saga.
I think during the course of our conversation, quite a number of those have actually come out. So just sort of recapping on some of those, and to help the inquiry with that, I might refer you to a report by the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman. They investigated a complaint against Sheffield City Council dated the 18th of September 2020, and I think that's just worth.
Yeah, they in fact produced 3 reports.
Okay.
That's one, and I'm very much aware of those reports.
Okay. And again, the policing protest panel's report, its conclusions and its recommendations, I think that they would be important for me. And to look at the tactical plans of South Yorkshire Police and the way they evolve and the way they change dynamically as they learn from each protest and how they respond to them. I think some of the frustrations that the police had going through this, which I highlighted some of that with relations with the council in particular, and the need for better communication, or regular better communication, longer term planning, looking ahead, sharing strategic plan with that. Communication, I think, has been a critical issue all the way through, and I think that would need to be thought again particularly by the council, how you communicate with police, with the public, with the protest groups. So, in summary, I think the following would have made a difference at the time. Clarity and understanding of the roles and responsibilities of various parties at the outset, communicating that to the public. What is the role of the council, the contractors, what is the role of the police? I mentioned the council and the police, their communications, getting that better all the way through, but certainly at the beginning. And again, clarity around consultation with the public, the detail of how the trees would be, particularly around how the trees would be selected. We haven't talked about this, but my understanding all the way through was that there was a panel, or at least originally there was a panel that would settle some of these issues, which seemed the obvious thing to do. And if a tree was dead, or diseased, or dangerous, there might be good grounds for that coming out. If it was causing a hazard to people with pushchairs or people in wheelchairs, there may be engineering solutions, not necessarily putting the tree out, but an engineering solution that could be. I had rational conversations with protesters around some of this. I think the council was reluctant to look at things like engineering solutions because they hadn't got that in the original contract. It might cost extra money. Well, I think sometimes you just have to go back and revisit some of those things. So I think some of that would, from my political perspective, that would be important to do. And just generally better engagement with people, and being clear who's in charge. Is it the leader of the council? Is it the person of the cabinet response? Who speaks for the council? Just as the police need to be clear who speaks for the police, both strategically and on the ground. Who on the ground can you go to when something is happening? You need to know these things. So there are sorts of lessons of that kind which I think can and should be learnt, and hopefully have been learnt.
Thank you very much. I think maybe you've dealt with my final question for you, which is, but let me check whether there's anything else you wanted to say on whether there's any more that needs to be done to minimise the risk of similar problems re-emerging in future.
No, I think if you pull together what I've said, there are things like you need clear leadership of all parties. You need to know who those people are, who's making the decisions, how they're being made, where they're being made at strategic level, at tactical level, at ground level. Who do you go to when you want information? And you need to be able to get answers. People like me need to be able to get answers from the city council or the police quickly. I've got to respond quickly, because the media come to me and they'll come to me in the morning and say we want to reply by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And if I don't know who to go to for answers to this, then the media carry on, and they may put out things which do need some correcting, misinformation, or simply say PCC not available, or didn't comment, or did not come back to us. These are fast-moving, dynamic situations, so good political grip on it, clarity around what your plans are, what your strategies are, and who you can go to, and regular consultations and updates for people, public and interest groups.
Thank you. Now, we've covered a lot of ground, and I've taken up more of your time than I thought I might need to, and I'm extremely grateful to you because you've provided a lot of valuable evidence. Is there anything else you'd like to tell me?
No, only that all the things I mentioned, documents, etc., that I mentioned, I can let you have, and they're all available, including things which I have not directly referenced, but I think are really relevant to you can give us to.
Thank you very much. It's incredibly valuable to have all that material. So, just to let people watching know, I was due a few minutes ago to start my next conversation. What will happen now is we will have a 5-minute pause, and then we will be back online with the next person who's coming for a chat. In the meantime, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Billings.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. You can turn the